I probably dealt with, say, 5 different farmers that I had never met in my life. They were all in their 60s and 70s, and I'm 19. And they never questioned whether I knew something or whether I was able to do them. They just took it for granted that I was a dealer. So I had to know all that sort of stuff. So I used my dad's influence on the fact that I just did it. But when I finished up the day at 6 o'clock, it was an enormous heavy day, and I had made one deal with the tractor with Mr. Reppel, and I went home and I went to the house that we bought, and Mrs. Elias was still in there, and she had supper, and she said, "Supper will be ready in a half an hour." I said, "I want any supper." I went upstairs to my bedroom, crawled into bed, and I literally cried myself to sleep. I was completely exhausted. I was completely famished. I remember saying, "Dad, what did you bring me into?" The next morning, I woke up and had breakfast there and went to work, and it was okay. That was a kind of a first day experience.
I can honestly say I don't think I'll ever have a more important, more influential guest than I have on today's episode. My father turns 93 in February 2025 and has, for those of you that know me, know my feelings towards my father, just an absolutely beautiful human being who I've had a tremendous relationship with, continue to have that with. He's been blessed with health and just has been such an impact on my life. And just thought, well, who better to talk about leadership than somebody who's been my most influence in terms of how I view leadership. And even though we certainly don't come from the same circles, as you'll hear in my dad's stories, his education is pretty limited in terms of a formal education, but his simplistic approach that's a little bit old school, that you just go ahead and do it, still rings true. And it was just an honor for me to sit down with my dad. And some of these stories I've heard before, but there's always more great stories that he tells, some of here that I hadn't heard before. But I hope you take this as being a slightly different episode and just a chance for me to pay a little homage to my father and a tribute to him and all the things he's learned. And again, I think he just speaks to us all, that we learn from all kinds of people that are very much in the same field and in the same sphere as we are, but certainly those that are a little bit outside our sphere and generations are ever as much educators as those of us that we work most closely with. So I hope you enjoy this episode of the Canadian Ed Leadership Show with my father, Elmo Shareski. What do you remember about your first experience with school?
Well, when we moved to Turtle Mountains, I was in grade 1. We had a permanent teacher who was a grade 11 student, actually, and did some. That was our teacher.
How many kids were in that class?
There was 3 of us in
grade 2, but in the one-room school, there were how many?
20.
All the way up to what, grade 8?
Grade 8. Yeah. That's all. That's as far as we went.
And so you started in grade 1 and you finished
grade 8.
Grade 8. Do you remember anything about any of the work you did or any memories that are still there about that time?
When I was going to school?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't really anything extraordinary. We had 1.5 miles to walk to school, and we walked to school summer and winter. My dad was of the opinion, we had horses and sleigh in the wintertime, but he was of the opinion that you couldn't walk to school, you must be sick. And if you're sick, then you stay at home. but his thought was never to hook up a team and drive us to school in a way. No, we just walked. It was stormy if the school closed, which happened many times. And we stayed at home, but otherwise, we went to school every day. And that was it.
And do you remember anything specifically that you learned, whether it was any, geography or science or anything like that, that in terms of like a memory of a learning experience?
Well, one of the experience when I was in grade 8, we had a history book, a little red history book. I can still see it. And all three of us, Corny Clausen, Gordon King, and I, which were in the class, we all failed. And we had a lady teacher from Altona. Mrs. Clausen was her name. And we all failed. It was so far away. We didn't understand it. And she says, we're going to do that exam once more. But before we do the exam, we're going to do some study. And I want you to come over to where I'm boarding, which was Paul Jansen's place, which was about a mile from, no, not quite a mile from where we live. So for 1 week, 5 days, we went there and we studied that red history book together. And then we wrote the exam and we all passed. Not really heavy. I think we were all in the 50s, but we did pass. And she says, there, no. And that taught us, all three of us, a lesson that if you really try really hard, you can always do it. It was a lesson we learned besides. She was a very, very, very good teacher. And she was an enjoyable teacher. It was a tough goal.
So there's grade 8, you finish school, and there's no high school opportunities to go to. So now you're basically working on the farm for your dad.
I came home from school on the 15th of June, and my dad looked at me and he says, "You're done school?" "Yep, I'm done school." "Okay," he said. "Then you go out and get those 4 horses together in the barn, harness them, and you go and disc that summer fall field." Okay, that's what I did. I was 14. Went out, chased the 4 horses in the barn, harnessed them, hooked up to the disc, and went and disced the summer fall. And that was just the beginning of my farming career.
So your teenage life, from age 14 to 19, you were on the farm.
Yep, on the farm. But then see, all my other brothers were all already left, so it was just Dad and I farmed. And then we were farming. We had tractors by that time, but we still bindered, cut crops with the binder, and Dad had a thrash machine, and he did all the thrashing in the community. That was still 2 of my brothers were still living with us. They were still there. And I was 14. No, I was 16 by that time. I wanted to drive a stook team, so I did.
What's that?
Well, with the thrash machine, you had about 5 people that had racks on wagons and went out and picked up the whole of the sheaves on the field and brought them into the thrash machine and fired them into the thrash machine to thrash them out, and the grain went into one spot and the straw went into another pile. So I was 16, and all the other ones were older guys. And I was loading machines on the rack, and I thought I had a fair load. But then when I drove to the tar fishing, and I saw the other guys with their loads were full, and they says, "How can you come with a half a load?" And they sort of mocked me because I'd only had, well, maybe about 2/3 of a load. I thought it was a pretty big load, but that's how I started. And then you just learn to do it right and to load a full load. That was, and then because I was driving a stud team and we didn't have room in the house to sleep for all these guys hauling the sheaves, so they had to sleep in the hayloft. Well, I was a man, so I slept in the hayloft with a blanket. Didn't have sleeping bag, but had a blanket. Half froze to death, but I mean, I wanted to be a man because the rest of the guys were doing that. So that was my start in working in there. And then eventually, when we got a combine, an A6 case combine, was pulled with a tractor, swathed and used combine to do the harvest.
So at that age, now we'll talk about what happens when you're 19. That's a different story. But up until that point, you're 16 years old. What are you thinking your future is going to be? What are you thinking you're going to do for the rest of your life at that age?
You know, we didn't really give that a lot of thought because we didn't know what was going on in the rest of the world, because we had we didn't have electricity. We had a little Coronado radio operated on 6 volts on 2 A dry batteries. And we could only watch Fibber McGee and Molly. That's about the only ones we could watch.
Listen.
That we listened to, not watch, but listen to it. And then, of course, the news. And so we couldn't listen to a lot of stuff because Dad wouldn't let us because it was too hard on the battery. So we entertained ourselves, but we didn't know a lot of what was going on in the rest of the world. We didn't know that.
So as far as you knew at that point, you're going to be farming for the rest of your life. That's what you're going to do.
That was the way it's going to be. Yeah.
So then age 19 comes along and your dad gets an idea to switch his career. What impacted you? So what was that? What happened there?
Well, by that time, all the other brothers were gone. 2 of them were married. So it was just Dad and me. And so when Dad made the deal with Mr. Elias to buy the dealership, it was an interesting thing when I look back at it, because we didn't see the dealership. We didn't know what they made.
So this is a John Deere dealership that's
John Deere dealership
90 miles away from where you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No less, about 100 miles away. 200 kilometers as it is now. But anyways, we didn't see it. We just took his word for it. It was really
But your dad had no experience in business or selling things. What made him think that he could run a John Deere dealership?
He never gave that a thought. Never. And I mean, and then all of a sudden, this was done on Sunday, but then we didn't make the deal until 1 o'clock in the morning because they didn't want to make a deal on Sunday. So we waited till 1 o'clock in the morning and we completed the deal. And then my dad said, "Okay, we got this deal done now. For me, Elmo, you go along with Mr. Elias, and you run the dealership." And if you stop and think about it, I was 19. I had a great education, and I was working on the farm, knew how to run the tractor and all that sort of stuff. And then he says, "You go and run the dealership, and then I'll finish harvesting, and then I'll have the auction sale, and then we'll come tomorrow." We bought the house along with the with the dealership. And it was one lesson that my dad taught us four brothers that was very valuable. He would tell us, and we ran a pretty big farm. We had two sections of land. We had a lot of cattle. We had a lot of pigs. We had a lot of chickens. And so we had a pretty big farm operation. And him and I were ones that ran the thing because the other brothers were all gone. But Dad would tell us four brothers certain things we had to do. And then he'd go off to town, and he never, ever told us how we're to do that. And we were standing around there and thinking, how are we going to do this? And I said, well, Dad says we should do it, then we must be able to do it. And we always did. And so that was the thing that brought me through this dealership thing, is that Dad says, well, you go and run the dealership and then I'll come later. So he didn't tell me. Nobody told me how to do it.
You never said to him, whoa, you better, what do you mean run a dealership? I don't even know what that means.
Never. We never questioned Dad.
So you get to Morden, and then what happens?
Get to Morden. The next morning, the Monday morning, we'd go to work. And Mr. Elias gave me about a half an hour instruction on, we had to fill out a contract A form when you sold a new tractor or a new tractor or a combine. You had to fill out this A form and a couple of other things. And well, he spent about a half an hour with me and then went off to his dealership in Winkler to run his car dealership. And so here I was, and I had a parts man and I had two mechanics in the back. And there was tractors and stuff in the shop there getting fixed up, and they were doing it. And the thing that brought me through all of this is I never questioned, how is this going to work? I just kind of did it. And so throughout that day, probably talked to 5 farmers that came in. Oh, I know one guy named Ed Rample. He was wanted to buy a new John Deere A tractor. We had A's and B's, and Model D's. That was the big one. They wanted to buy a John Deere A tractor.
And this is 1951.
This is 1951. And so I got the price book out, and we talked about it, and he had a B to trade, and my parts man was a little familiar with what went on there because he had been the parts man for PR Elias for a couple of years, so he was a help. And throughout the day, I probably dealt with, say, 5 different farmers that I had never met in my life. They were all in their 60s and 70s, and I'm 19, and they never questioned whether I knew something or whether I was able to do something. They just took it for granted that I was a dealer. So I had to know all that sort of stuff. So I used my dad's influence on the fact that I just did it. But when I finished up the day at 6 o'clock, it was an enormous heavy day. And I had made one deal with the tractor with Mr. Reppel. And I went home, and I went to the house that we bought, and Mrs. Elias was still in there, and she had supper. And she said, supper will be ready in a half an hour. I said, I want any supper. I went upstairs to my bedroom, crawled into bed, and I literally cried myself to sleep. I was completely exhausted. I was completely famished. I remember saying, Dad, what did you bring me into? This was. The next morning, I woke up and had breakfast there and went to work, and it was okay. That was a kind of a first day experience.
So I'm thinking about the fact that you're 19, and how many people were working at John Deere that you were managing?
I had 2 mechanics and a parts man.
So again, I think that's another thing. It's one thing to run a dealership, but it's another thing to be in charge, essentially, be the boss of these three guys at 19 who are all older than you were and more experienced. How did you navigate that? Like you said, there was a bit of an acceptance that, oh, you must know what you're doing. But at the same time, you're 19 years old. Certainly, they got to be looking at you like this guy doesn't was to be the boss. So how did you figure out how to treat people in such a way that they respected you and were able to get the most out of them?
Well, it was again the lesson that Dad taught us, told us what to do and never told us how. And that lesson was involved in that decision. They never questioned my ability to run a dealership. They never, ever once said, what do you know about it? No, they never did. They just, whatever I said, and I took them as their position. I recognized their position. They were mechanics. I wasn't a mechanic. I did some mechanical work, but I mean, I wasn't a mechanic. I wasn't in the parts man. Bill Giesbrecht was the parts man. He knew what to do, and that was it. My job was to keep everything going and selling equipment. That was my job, and they did the rest. So it wasn't a matter of saying, well, what do I know? You know, I just did. And there was things that I didn't really recognize or know. But anyways, our field man for John Deere checked our stock and that sort of stuff. Came by. This was about, I'd like to near a month that we were, and he said to me, he said, you have to have a contract with John Deere. I says, yeah, you can't operate without a contract. You got to go to the head office in Winnipeg on Notre Dame, 1485 Notre Dame. I can still remember that. John Deere, and see the head guy, and he'll write up a contract for you. Okay. So I drove to Winnipeg, went to the place, Mr. Sheffield. How can I remember that? I don't know, but it's 70 years ago. Anyways, they said, he's the head guy and he's in that corner office. You got to go. Okay, got to go. And he was probably, I would say he was in his 60s or 65, something like that. I'm still 19 years old, so that's quite an age difference. And he says, what can I do for you? I says, somebody tells me, or your blackman tells me that I need a contract. Well, what do you need a contract for? Well, I said, I'm a John. He says, how did you become a John Deere dealer? Well, I says, we traded a farm for John Deere. Have you been selling John Deere? I said, yeah. How can you sell? You haven't got a contract. I didn't know that I needed a contract. Well, now you need a contract. So what if I don't give you a contract? I said, I don't know. I have no idea what goes on. No, he said, don't worry. I'll give you a contract. So he wrote up a contract for me. From there on, we just carried on. I was doing stuff that was way over my head. If I think back of it now, I thought, what in the wide world was I doing there? That wasn't the first time, so that worked out okay.
So then, I'm thinking about, you went from there and then you ran the McLeod store. So you owned that. And then you were general manager at Farm King. And then you were the building and planning inspector. Yeah.
Building inspector.
And then finishing your career working at the RV and managing that. So all of those jobs, though, you were leading people. There were people that were working for you along the way. So when you think back to just that general experience of leadership, what kind of lessons did you kind of learn along the way with those things? Maybe some mistakes you made that you realized, oh, that's not the way to lead, or things that just always you kind of kept with it. You talked about the fact that you trusted people that did their job. You let them kind of do what they need to do. You didn't kind of maybe tell them what to do because you assumed they knew what to do. But what other kind of lessons do you think you learned in all of those, in all that work?
What exactly what you're saying is the fact that I was doing stuff that I really wasn't, like, say, that planning district. I mean, I was not aware of what everything was, but again, my father's instruction of just go out and do that. And when they entrusted me with the position, they must think that I know how to run it, so I just better do it. And I did. Doing a lot of research and reading to find out what I really was supposed to do. I mean, I did a little carpenter work, but I hadn't gone to any schooling for knowing how to assess the builders, whether they were doing it right or whether they weren't doing it right. That was, but throughout each day you learn stuff, and it was, I would say, it was a real hand of God to give me the knowledge to be able to do that, even to run the Farm King operation with about 40 guys working in the back, and dealing with dealers who bought our equipment. And it was always the fact that somehow it will work. And like I say, that going back to the first day of my working the dealership, I guess that's what we got to do, and we got to do it. It seemed to work out okay, and it amazed me. I mean, with a little education that I had, that I was able to perform that. And I meet guys today who worked for me at that time, and they give me the word that I still was the best boss they ever had. That was I had that said to me the other day, about 10 days ago. Henry Ham, who he was working in the back. He says, Elmo, the days you were running that dealership, that factory, that was the best 5 years of my life. So, I mean, those were very, very nice things, which I didn't think I was doing anything special. I just did what I was supposed to do. That was the main thing. Just that lesson I learned from my dad. He says, go out and do that. Well, then my dad thought I should be able to do it, and I did. I guess that's the way I got my education in the business world.
What do you think when you look back to all those different careers? Was there one that sort of stands out that maybe it's towards the end of your career? That was the most satisfying work that I did, and you feel most proud of a particular job that you had?
Well, I think running Sun Valley RV was probably the most exciting job that I had, because I dealt with so many people from all over Manitoba and even in Saskatchewan and to as far as BC. I had customers that we dealt with from the RV business, and they would come back and say how good the RV ran and all that sort of stuff. I think that was most satisfying. I was there 20 years. It was good. And working with Triple E, who are just finest organization that you can find, and the most caring people and the most honest people. And they taught me a lot of stuff, and I still are great friends with all the people from the Triple E organization. I meet up with them coffee every once in a while, and we talk about old times, and they said compliments to me. You did a great job. I says, well, I just did as I was told. And that I learned from my dad. My dad's instruction right from the beginning, because my dad, he came to Canada at 18 and didn't know a word of English and didn't know nothing. And made a great career. Was invented a lot of things, but did a lot of things that were way over his head, but he did them. And that's where I learned to say, well, I guess if Dad said, well, then let's do it.